Sorry, I'm a little late. I had a bit of problem getting my slides working, so I'm just going to be scrolling through them. So my name is Gabriel. I work at .cloud. So we're a platform that takes the pain out of web app deployment. If you want to know more about .cloud, I'm not going to really talk about us very much today, but come talk to me after. We're also hiring, so you can talk to me about that too. Okay, on to business. How many people here know Django? Okay, so the majority of you. And most of you who know Django probably started out with the polls tutorial. Do you guys all know the polls tutorial? Does that ring a bell? Yeah? Basically, it's a really simple application. It's the very first tutorial for Django. You create polls, you create answers to the polls, and it's great, except what if you want to refresh the page for each vote? If you don't want to refresh the page for each vote. So the Django docs don't really give us an answer to that. The closest they do is they hint somewhere in the view docs about returning a view from JSON. What you end up with when you try to do this with jQuery and just returning random JSON from blobs or from random views in Django is something like this. We had the same question when we were building out our dashboard. Our site's built on Django, but we have a lot of views that are actually checking the state of physical web servers that are running our customers' code rather than querying the Django database. So for us, being asynchronous is a must. So our answer was, like I said, jQuery spaghetti. A huge, messy pile of it. And as we added more one-off Django views, we realized that it was just getting completely incomprehensible. Okay, so here's what Django looks like. We have, basically, Django is talking to the database, spitting out HTML, which goes to the user. But this is really Django, this is actually sort of hiding the full picture. Really Django, right, there's the Django model layer, which talks to the database, the Django view layer, and which uses Django templates to actually spit out that HTML. The problem really comes when you start doing this. When you have this jQuery and JSON running down the side, it creates pain. So Ember is a better way to do this. Ember basically cuts out the ugly part of that application. So instead of using Django's template rendering, everything just goes from a Django view directly into JSON, serialized, sent to Ember over the wire as data, and then all of the HTML rendering happens on the client side. Okay, so what we're going to do in the short time that remains is we're going to refactor the polls app as an Ember app. So let's take a really quick look at the finished product, if I can find it. Let's just do. Oh, where are you, mouse? Okay. Okay. So here, how can I do this? Do I actually be able to see? Here is our awesome polls app. Okay, so you can see that we, right now, on our homepage, we see a list of polls, which is only one. We can do another. Go into the poll. We can add So let's go build this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is expose. So this is the Django, the models of the poll. Like I mentioned before, we have a poll model that has a question. We have a choice that is has a foreign key to a poll, the actual choice field, and the number of votes. So what we're going to do is expose this as an API using big blank space. And it's going to look a little something like this. So this is how we're going to serialize our questions, and this is how we're going to serialize our polls. Sorry, other way around. And to do that, we're going to use Django REST Framework. How many people have heard of REST Framework before? Okay, it's one of several ways to expose things over a REST API from Django, and it's pretty awesome as far as I'm concerned. It uses the new class-based views. So the first thing we're going to do is create our resources. And sorry, I'm going to have to really fly through this because we are really short on time. But it's fairly straightforward. There's only a few little tricky parts, but basically we're just creating a model resource. So it essentially, much like a model form in Django, it just exposes our field essentially for us. There are a few tweaks we need to make in order to get the exact format that we want. Particularly, we're going to have to exclude some fields and include some other fields because we want to pass IDs, which aren't passed by default. I'm going to put this code online afterwards, so you can check it out there. Don't try to type it out or anything while I'm talking. Next, we're going to create our views, which are essentially referencing. It's really just boilerplate. It's just referencing these resources that we created previously. Now we're going to create our URLs, which again are just referencing these views. And as you can see, passing along the primary keys. And we're going to add that to the root URLs, along with this Django REST framework stuff that is, again, just boilerplate. Whoa, we have a big red thing. Hello. Okay. Change of plans. Like I said, had some problems getting this exported properly. Okay, so let's go quickly play with this API. So we can do that via curl, but luckily for us, Django REST Framework also exposes itself HTML endpoints so that we can just do it in the browser. So much like the Django admin, I don't know how much of that you guys can see, but basically Django REST Framework just builds out, you can essentially see the different format types that it can return here. And one of them is HTML. So it'll actually give you the sort of the raw API, what would be returned by your API as, but with, nicely formified. Okay, so our API, although we didn't really go through it because we don't have too much time, looks pretty good. Let's move on to the Ember part. So, what is Ember? Ember consists, there's sort of three main parts to Ember. The first is the standard library. So Ember includes what they call a standard library, but it's really mostly lower level than what we call a standard library in Python. It's mostly things that we get from the object system and from built-ins. So it's mostly, like I said, it's things that we sort of, as Python developers, really take for granted. Things like iteration, map and filter, and properties are just language features for us, but in JavaScript they're sorely lacking. So it's really more like when they say standard library, it's really more like C's standard library. Like it's stuff that it's really difficult. You'd end up implementing it again yourself if you didn't have it to write large complex applications. So I kind of think of it as if Python standard library is batteries included, then Ember standard library is kind of the screws that were missing in the original toy that hold it together. The central part of all of that is the Ember object system. And it's a lot like it's an object system that's built on top of the JavaScript object system, and it adds a lot of features that makes it very Pythonic in a lot of ways, with a few extra features to sort of help handle JavaScript asynchronicity. So personally, I'm a big fan of powerful tools that solve problems completely. Some people complain that Django is too big and tries to do too much. As you can probably tell from my description of the standard library, Ember is like way bigger than Django ever will be. So if you really don't like big frameworks, maybe this isn't the one for you. You might want to check out Backbone or something a little more minimalistic. But if, like me, you want to think about building these abstractions at a separate time from when you're implementing applications that need to use these abstractions, then I think Ember is probably a good fit, because it eliminates a lot of your busy work. Okay. So another interesting feature that was on that list is Ember's binding system. So Ember has these things called bindings that are sort of similar to Python properties, with the additional awesomeness of having a dependency graph on top of that. So what that means is that when an ancestor property changes, if you have another property that's dependent upon it, those properties will, the changes in properties will propagate down. There's also sanity checks by default to make sure that propagation doesn't happen repeatedly for, if you're, say, changing the first name and the last name and you have a computed property that is the full name, you only want that computed property to change once, even if you change the first name and last name separately. So Ember does that by default. Part of what makes it neat is that because it's baked into the Ember object system, it works for data, as you'd expect, but it's especially cool to have this built into the templating, so that your templates are automatically updating in response to your data as well. The last rather large component of Ember is the MVC and app structure, and so this is more of the type of stuff that we get from Django, or when we think of web frameworks. And that's what most of the rest of what we're talking about is. Okay, let's build out the client side of this application. So the first thing we're going to need to do is install Ember. Now I have here just a little diagram of how I like to lay out my static files, and you'll notice that I have I have a lib that is separate from my JS. And that's just because I find that when you're building sort of larger JavaScript applications, you end up with so many files that it's really nice to keep your sort of external dependencies, like your Ember and handlebars and all of that, separate from your own JavaScript files. Why can't I see you? So, all I have here is basically our just the dependencies that are needed for Ember, including Ember itself. And you can see that I'm creating this application object. This application object this is going to be the one object that we put into the global namespace. Sorry, it is a class, not an object. No, I'm lying. And so basically, we're creating it here essentially as a namespace to hang everything else off of. And so then so everything above the creation of that is everything up here. These are all the dependencies, and then we create the application object, then everything down here is going to be our files. And then at the bottom, you can see that we have this app.initialize, so that runs after we've attached everything on to the app. So Ember does what's called dependency injection by default. So what that essentially means is that you almost never define instances or create instances of classes. For most top-level objects, you'll create the class, attach it to the application, and the application will grab that class and actually instantiate it for you. This is one of those magic things that some people love and some people hate. Personally, I find it really useful, but I can certainly understand why others might dislike it a little bit. There are also some weird things in Ember about again, kind of useful, but certainly a little bit magical. They use naming conventions for a lot of things. So if you have an app template or an application template, an application controller, and an application view, it will wire all of those together for you. Okay, so all I'm doing here is just putting the template into the list of URLs, so it gets rendered out. Okay, so the first piece that we're putting in, you probably maybe saw it. It was the one thing that we'd included after the application object. So we're going to define our data layer. So in much the same way as Django, Ember stores its data in models, although the number of fields that they offer are much fewer. What you can see here is that I'm creating a store. Can you guys actually see the code, or is it way too small? It's fine? Okay. So this store is what allows, instead of in Django, right, we communicate with a database. In Ember, we communicate with some backend service. And basically, the store is what does the translation between the formats that Ember expects and the formats that our server provides. So there are a few options here that I'm instantiating, but basically I'm just using Ember's built-in REST adapter, although actually I have some custom patches on it to make it work with, it's really built in a Rails-centric way, and make some strange assumptions about what REST APIs look like that they usually don't. So again, that will be you can find that on my GitHub. Hopefully though, they will be merging that back in soon enough that we can just use the default built-in one. And then I'm also defining two models that are essentially just reflections of the two Django models that we saw before. Okay, I'm actually going to skip this. I was going to just click through the application again, but as you guys hopefully remember, there are essentially two states. So when we first enter the application, we enter through the root, and then we get put into this polls state where we're looking at the list of polls. And then we can click on a poll and go into an individual poll. But the point is that the way that Ember models application state is as this sort of hierarchical state graph. So like I said, sorry, we come in through the top level. The way Ember templates work is a direct reflection of that. So at this top level root, we have our application template, which is this outer box. And then Ember defines what are called outlets, which are essentially little holes that you can plug sub-templates into. So as we go down into the polls, we get automatically redirected into the polls view, the multiple polls. This outlet gets filled in with the polls template. Then when we click over on a specific poll, we'll jump back up to the root, so it will be emptied. That outlet will be emptied. And then replaced with the poll view. So let's look at how that actually plays out. The application template is, as you can see, quite simple. We just define a top-level block and then this outlet tag. You can see that these actually look quite a bit like Django templates. This is using the default template library is Handlebars, which is also by Yehuda Katz, the author of Ember. This is our polls template. So again, fairly straightforward. Basically, we're just iterating over each of the polls in the controller, and then outputting the length of the choices, or to say how many options there are. And somewhere, see it right here, we have this action, this show poll action. So that's what's going to actually cause us to go sort of back up through that router and then back down to the specific poll. So you can see we're passing in the poll as context there. Oh, apparently I'm drawing. Oh, God. Why you shouldn't run slides in your editor. Here's the specific poll view. So in a very similar way, we're iterating over the choices. And here we have two other actions. These ones, instead of targeting, so by default, you saw that previous action, we didn't have to specify a target. That's because by default, it targets the router. In this case, though, we want to target the controller, which you will see momentarily. And basically, this is just doing the vote up and the vote down actions. So how do these templates actually get put together? You can actually embed these templates directly into your top-level HTML file. But if you're going to do that from Django, like I said, these templates actually look very similar to Django templates, so they will be parsed to Django templates, which causes a bit of difficulty. So you can use a template tag that will essentially take verbatim what you put within it and insert it into your template. But it's kind of a big hassle, and having all of your templates in one file is really not a very good idea. I think that's a bit of a code smell. So you're really better off using the precompiler, which you can find on my GitHub there, or you can just install, if you already have Node installed, it uses Node because it's written in JavaScript, you can just install it like so. A little plug for another little app I work on or built, Python Pro is basically just it's a way to, it's a generic file watcher and will rerun tasks when files change. So it's useful to use that to update your rendered or your compiled templates. Okay, let's look really quickly at the views and controllers. Oh, or not, because I don't have the code there. And so we'll skip to the Ember router, which is really the most interesting and important part. So, like I said, it's basically just a direct representation in code of this state graph. Now, it actually is very explicit about being a state graph. I don't just mean that it is, sort of encapsulates state somehow. It actually, you write it as a state machine, which has really three big benefits. One is that it prevents impossible states. Two is that it allows you to log what states you're in. You can turn on logging, and it can give you the full trace of a user through your application. And finally, it lets you debug live apps if you so choose, which actually is something that Apple used on their iCloud project. They had a really subtle bug that was only affecting a small portion of their users, which of course was tens of thousands of people. And so they turned on debugging for everyone, and when there was an error, they would push that back up to the server. And so what that allowed their QA team to do is actually get back into the exact same state, follow the entire path through as their users had in order to reproduce the bug. So there are a few things that are missing that we haven't covered yet. First is creating new polls and choices, and the breadcrumb. Those are the two things that were implemented in the demo that I didn't go over. And there were a couple improvements you could make that we really should make. One is using push state for routing. I don't know if you noticed, but we were using hash-based routing, which Twitter infected the world with and really is not the best way to go. Push state-based routing allows you to have real proper URLs without that ugly hash in there. And we also are not loading very efficiently right now. I don't know if you guys noticed again, but right now we're just loading each object individually, which is not a very good way to go. So we should be bulk loading them.
we are all out of time, so that is the end. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? I don't know if we actually have time for questions. But I will be around after if anyone would like to ask me questions later.